Hello and welcome back. This is the week 11 lecture. So this week we're talking about African American cinema, and we have the one chapter from the book to read. It begins on page 497. And as far as the movies for this week, I'm actually giving you guys a choice. So our originally scheduled film is Do the Right Thing, directed by Spike Lee. That's still one of the choices, but I've also provided an alternate film, Daughters of the Dust, directed by Julie Dash. I would encourage you guys to watch both if you have time this week. They're both really good movies. They're very different. They sort of give you two very different experiences, but I'm also providing Daughters of the Dust in case some of us would rather not watch Do the Right Thing, because I will just sort of give you a brief warning, and I've put this in the module for this week as well. Do the Right Thing does contain some violence and some sexual material that some viewers might find objectionable. So if you don't really like that kind of stuff, it's also very intense, particularly at the end. It can be a little bit upsetting for some people. So if that sounds like something you would rather avoid, Daughters of the Dust is not without some drama and tension as well, but it doesn't have that same amount of violence and sexual content. So that's why I gave you the choice. But like I said, if you're curious and you want to experience both, I would definitely encourage you to do that. And also feel free to read up on them a little bit more online. I'm going to talk about both here in lecture, but there might be some spoilers, and I'm going to talk about some sort of bigger picture stuff that would make a little bit more sense after you've already watched the films. So before you watch the films, if you're watching this beginning part of the lecture without having seen the films yet, you might want to Google them, read a little bit more about them before you make your final decision. But be sure to watch at least one, if not both. You'll have a chance to talk about them on this week's discussion board. All right, so we'll get to the movies later, but first let's just cover what we see in the chapter. I'll move through it kind of quickly, and we're going to treat this week in general sort of how we did the Latin American cinema and the French cinema weeks. So we're kind of taking a break from our major sort of Hollywood mainstream cinema narrative that we've been telling throughout the semester to explore some other types of representation, to sort of explore what other communities were doing, what kinds of films were getting created, maybe a little bit off the radar, a little bit sort of outside the notice of a lot of mainstream, film goers, but we're also going to watch to see how African American cinema has always been around. It's not a new thing, but for a long time it was kind of underground, or it was sort of marginalized in various ways, and now it's a lot more prominent, and we can talk about maybe some of the reasons for that. So we'll just kind of go through the history, and then we'll talk a little bit more about some specific figures, really going all the way back to like the 1950s, some actors and filmmakers, Spike Lee and Julie Dash included, who really helped to change things. But as the book points out, African Americans have appeared in U.S. films really from the very beginning of film history, going all the way back to Thomas Edison's kinetoscope movies in the 1890s, those sort of like peep show style movies where you had to put your eye to a small screen and watch the movie within this device. We talked about those back in maybe weeks 1 and 2, but many of those films featured African American performers. But as the book points out, these were often very stereotypical and racist caricatures. And even looking at some of the titles of those films that they mention in the chapter, I mean, it's not hard to tell that these were very racist depictions of, Black Americans. And as the book also points out, this was a sort of long-standing tradition maybe some of you are familiar with this if you've taken, some U.S. history classes, but there was a long tradition of minstrel shows. They were often part of vaudeville performances. So we've talked about vaudeville throughout the class as kind of a predecessor of modern motion pictures. Kind of like stage plays, this was an older art form, an older type of entertainment. Vaudeville really kind of goes back to the 19th century, but a lot of the elements of vaudeville would kind of show up later in movies. So I've mentioned this before, but a lot of vaudeville would be kind of like variety shows. So there would be like some musical performances, and then maybe like what we might call sketch comedy, like some brief comedic things, and then they might have some other types of things as well, but there'd be sort of a variety of different performances for the paying audience, and one of those would often be like a minstrel or a sort of blackface performance, where you'd often have white performers, sometimes African American performers too, performing in blackface, which means they would kind of put on this heavy makeup so they would appear as a sort of caricatured version, of an African American character, and they would often be singing or dancing or doing very stereotypical things for the amusement of a white audience. So like they say in the book, these black characters, the way they were depicted was often for comedy. And again, very racist. We don't really accept that form of entertainment anymore. But you can't ignore it when you're kind of telling this history. Like, that was an important sort of tradition when it comes to entertainment in this country. It's kind of gone away, but certainly when movies first started out in the 1890s and the very early years of the 20th century, these, vaudeville shows were still going on. Like, they were still in existence. So a lot of that kind of showed up in early U.S. films, and kind of moving forward to like feature-length silent films, as they say in the book, a lot of these, early silent movies continued to have these very unfavorable and racist portrayals of African Americans. And a great example of that is Birth of a Nation, which I think we've mentioned before, but kind of a landmark movie that comes out in 1915, directed by D.W. Griffith. It's usually regarded as one of the first really good feature-length movies ever created in the States. So again, it comes out in 1915, so obviously very old, long before the civil rights movement, and a lot of progress was made in race relations. So probably not a surprise that the movie is very racist. But if you watch it today, and some people generally try to avoid it today, but if you see it now, you might almost be stunned at just how openly racist it is. Like, the heroes of the film really are KKK members, and it very much romanticizes the Ku Klux Klan and sort of the lost cause of the South. You can read more about it if you're interested in the film. What makes the film, I think, very difficult to kind of deal with or talk about is it has this kind of dual identity. On one hand, a lot of film historians and scholars still regard it as a real masterpiece from a technical standpoint. It was, again, this really innovative early example of a feature-length movie, and Griffith was kind of an early master director. He was able to pioneer stuff in terms of camera work and editing. The film looks a lot more modern than many other films from that period. The camera moves a little bit more. The editing is more fast-paced. There's action sequences. They're able to capture scenes of high drama and action in a more modern way. It doesn't feel so staged. It doesn't feel like a stage play, which is how so many of those old silent movies were. So it's very innovative technically, really just down the line. Great acting, set design, the camera work, the editing, the way it all looks. It was very affecting. But when you look at the themes, the plot, and the character development, again, extremely, even violently racist. So people are kind of conflicted about how to sort of treat it. Some people want to ignore it because of its obvious racist, message, but it is still important technically, just as a sort of a forward step in terms of like technical cinematic components, again, editing, camera work, and just how the movie looked. But it was very typical of silent films of that era in terms of its very racist portrayal of African Americans. And what the book also points out is there really weren't a lot of opportunities during these early decades of movies. There weren't many opportunities for black filmmakers to sort of counter these really pernicious, racist, stereotypical portrayals because they were often denied access and the resources to make movies. So as we've been talking about, this was really true for almost all marginalized communities because Hollywood, beginning in the 20s, really had such an iron grip on, filmmaking in America, controlled for many decades all three levels: production, distribution, and exhibition. If you weren't within that machine, if you weren't within the Hollywood framework, it was going to be difficult, especially if you were a woman, African American, LGBTQ. It's going to be very difficult for you to make a movie that anybody could actually see. But there was one interesting exception, and they talk about him in the book, Oscar Micheaux, who was really the first African American filmmaker that we're sort of aware of. And he directed the oldest surviving black directed film from 1920, a film called Within Our Gates. Again, there might have been some earlier stuff that did not survive because, as we learned, for a long time, film preservation was not very good. A lot of old silent movies have been lost because we didn't always store them or preserve them very effectively. But the oldest one that does survive is Within Our Gates, and that's directed by Micheaux. So he was the first African American that we know of who produced feature-length films and then distributed those films and also arranged for them to be exhibited, to be shown to paying audiences. So again, he's covering all three of those levels of vertical integration, like the Hollywood studios. He was producing them, distributing them, and then making sure that they could play in movie theaters for audiences. And he was the first African American to be able to do that. And the way he did that was he created his own company. He couldn't do it within the Hollywood framework because it was far too prejudiced at the time. So Micheaux kind of creates a template that future African American filmmakers like Spike Lee will follow. He creates his own film company. So they raised the money, they produced the films themselves, and he also had distribution branches. He was mostly based in Chicago, but as they mention in the book, he also had a distribution office in Virginia. And they were able to sell the movie to predominantly, black theaters in urban centers, largely in northern cities where there were large African American populations, like New York City, Philadelphia, Chicago. Not many white people were watching these movies. They were largely made for and sort of targeted at, a black audience because, again, everything was so segregated back then. Typically, whites and blacks didn't go and watch things together. You had to, they were often kept separate, certainly in the South, but in other parts of the country too. So a lot of these played in predominantly African American areas for predominantly African American audiences. But just the fact that he was able to do that in the 1920s and 1930s, pretty impressive. And a lot of his films survive. We can still watch them. You can still find a lot of them. And he's obviously a very, very influential and important figure. And they make an important point in the book. They mention that a lot of his movies dealt with kind of controversial subject matter, often pertaining to race relations. Treating stuff like lynching, the phenomenon of passing, where, light-skinned African Americans could sometimes pass as white, which of course would have many advantages for a person back then. Urban crime, all these sort of controversial topics. He would deliver messages about those topics, but as they put it in the book, he would do that within a sort of familiar entertainment framework. In other words, he doesn't let the message make the movies boring or sort of overly preachy. They're still fast-moving, entertaining films, often centered around, relationships and various personal dramas. But they also contain this sort of social commentary or these larger messages about race relations in America and sort of what's going on, current events at the time that he's making those films. Another important sort of landmark, and they talk about it in the book, is The Jazz Singer, a film that comes out in 1927, and we've talked about it as really the first sound movie. It's often, at least in the U.S., it's often defined or sort of categorized that way. So really, African American representation is very much tied up with the dawn of the sound age, because The Jazz Singer, again, the first sort of talkie in the modern sense, comes out in the late 20s, and it stars Al Jolson, who had been a vaudeville and stage performer before sort of transitioning to movies. He was an actor and a singer, and if you ever read up about him, I think he's got a pretty good Wikipedia page, you'll see that he was largely famous, not exclusively, but largely due to his blackface performances. So he was a white guy who would often don blackface and perform as an African American, often while singing or doing, music. And there's a real, racist caricature at work with any kind of blackface performance. Jolson, no different. They do make the argument in the book. I mean, you might have to watch the movie to really be able to decide if you agree with this, but they argue that the way Jolson sort of plays his character in the film is not as racist, is not as stereotypical as the way a lot of other vaudeville performers would have done blackface. I honestly don't have the context or the knowledge of vaudeville to really be able to assess the accuracy of that statement. I just know that most modern people find blackface objectionable just on its face, just in general, and I'm not sure that Jolson's performance would really be any different. But again, that's largely what he was known for. He does it some in the movie, though that's not all that's happening in the movie. So again, the fact that a film that important, the first sound movie, the fact that it is, again, sort of tapping into African American culture, albeit in a racist way. And again, it's showing that influence of the earlier blackface minstrel shows, that would have shown up in vaudeville. So that's all kind of an uncomfortable part of cinematic history. Unfortunately, a lot of people, when they talk about the dawn of the sound age and they mention The Jazz Singer, they might mention Al Jolson, but they don't always want to get into what exactly Jolson was famous for, because again, 100 years later, to our modern perspective, it's a little bit distasteful, and it's fine to feel that way. But we can obviously still notice that, again, even though it was kind of in an objectionable way, African Americans were still sort of an important part of these, significant moments in film history in this country in particular. And then they mention in the book, really during the Jazz Singers era, and then a little bit beyond it during the 1920s and 1930s, you have this sort of new genre that becomes popular in America, and it's often called the antebellum drama or antebellum plantation dramas. The best example being Gone with the Wind, which comes out in 1939. We're not watching that movie. Many of you are probably familiar with it, even if you haven't seen it. But there were a lot of other movies kind of similar to it that came out during those decades. And they were just basically set in the antebellum South, and they often featured sort of romanticized or idyllic sort of portrayals of plantation life and sort of pseudo-aristocratic white people, and often happy and contented slaves who were, happy to be there and happy to help the white people, do whatever they were doing. So again, to modern that's kind of an objectionable genre, really, because it really kind of whitewashed the realities of slavery and what life was really like for African Americans in the antebellum South. But it was popular with largely white audiences. And they also mentioned there were several adaptations, I think going all the way back to the 20s, of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a novel that some of you should be familiar with. Famous American novel, comes out in the 1850s, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. It's an abolitionist novel, which means it's very much anti-slavery in its message, and it's often viewed as very influential. Some people even say it helped contribute to the eventual outbreak of the Civil War, which happened just a few years later, although that's kind of hard to prove. But certainly it made a big splash in the 1850s. A lot of people read it. A lot of people in the South were angry about it, frankly, because it portrayed white plantation owners in the South in a less than favorable light. But what was funny about, maybe funny is not the right word, what was strange about a lot of the movie adaptations of that book, and they mention this in our book, the sort of moral or ethical message of Stowe's novel, which was basically slavery is wrong and we need to stop it, kind of got lost. And instead, they would just kind of use all the trappings, the setting, the types of characters that appeared in her novel. Some heroic white people and some sort of servile, kind of contented but maybe sort of long-suffering slave characters who were very loyal to the good white people. Maybe they wanted to be free, but, they really weren't very independent, kind of childlike, because frankly, that's how they appeared in Stowe's book, even though it was an anti-slavery message. To a modern audience, her portrayal of African Americans was very, maybe a little bit insulting, again, sort of viewing them kind of as children who needed to be taken care of, and that's not generally the way modern people would want to think about it. So the movies weren't really importing the anti-slavery message from the book. They were just importing kind of all the bad stuff from the book. That kind of paternalistic, condescending way of looking at African American characters and also valorizing certain white characters who kind of decide to do the right thing. So those were popular, but again, they were very popular because people liked the costumes and like the architecture. These were movies that were often largely defined by set design, costumes, hair. They looked great. Even if you look at Gone with the Wind, again, it was largely celebrated because it sort of captured a particular point in time, or it captured a sort of historical milieu that is interesting, to a lot of people. However, again, the portrayal of African American characters pretty objectionable by modern standards. But the one thing to point out with Gone with the Wind, even though it didn't really do its black characters many favors on the sort of level of theme or plot, it is noteworthy for being the film that launched Hattie McDaniel to being the first African American to ever win an Oscar. So Hattie McDaniel won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actress for her portrayal of Mammy, who's basically just, a slave, a servant of the O'Hara family. But she was a well-liked character. She's shown to have some wit and some, fortitude and strength. She's very important, for other characters in the film. And audiences responded very favorably to her. She won the Oscar, and that's some form of progress, even if the portrayal, the role that she's forced to play, maybe was not the greatest. So that's 1939, and we continue to kind of move forward. So after World War II, as they point out in the book, Hollywood starts to move closer to more honest, sort of authentic representations of black characters and life. So getting there slowly. The book also uses some language that I thought we could maybe just unpack a little bit, because you see certain terms kind of showing up over and over again. They say that after World War II, and again, this is debatable, but a lot of critics and scholars will agree that you start to see change at around this time. After World War II, they say Hollywood developed a little bit more of a social conscience and became maybe a little bit more aware of the unjust conditions in this country as it pertained to race relations. And they start to adopt what the book refers to as a liberal humanist framework. And I'm not exactly sure what they mean by that, but basically they're using that as a way to categorize a certain type of film that starts to come out in the late 40s and then maybe into the 1950s. And these are movies that often explicitly dealt with race and explicitly sort of provided commentary on how things were not right when it came to race relations in America. So they mention a few of these: Intruder in the Dust, which is based on a book by William Faulkner, Home of the Brave, Lost Boundaries. All of those came out in 1949. But you kind of get the feeling, or at least I do, reading this chapter, that the author of the chapter maybe doesn't really love that liberal humanist framework, because he does make the point that a lot of these movies kind of featured a black hero who's almost like a saint, almost like, better than any person really could be. And they're sort of used as an example of why racism is wrong. But there's kind of a sense that maybe these movies aren't always like super realistic. And one criticism that many do have is that when you treat any person or representative of a group like that, you're not really treating them as a human, right? Like, it's better to have more well-rounded portrayals, because everybody is complicated, everybody has different sides to them. When you present a hero who's just sort of infallible and is, again, sort of saint-like, that doesn't always strike people as super realistic. But a good example of kind of what they're talking about can sort of be found in the actor Sidney Poitier, who they talk about at length in the chapter. He's a very important person. You might not have heard of him. He's been dead for a while, but your grandparents or, older people in your life probably remember him. If you're as old as me, your parents sort of grew up watching him. Poitier was originally from Miami. I think he was the son of Bahamian immigrants. They came over from the Bahamas. He sort of made it as a young actor at a time when not many African American actors really could find mainstream success. He breaks through in the early 50s, but as a lot of people point out, in many of Poitier's early roles, he is this kind of black saint character where he's like this, exemplar of virtue that everybody's supposed to recognize and admire so they can do the right thing. And he wasn't always playing maybe very realistic actual people. But just the fact that he becomes a movie star in the 1950s, just that fact by itself is pretty significant. So we've come a long way from Oscar Micheaux, who was making pretty much all black movies with all black casts. All of the creatives working on the movie would have been African American. But again, those films didn't get national distribution. They were playing in certain theaters, but only in select places and primarily only for African American audiences. See, Poitier, who later started directing as well, it was different. Poitier had what we could call mainstream success or crossover success, which means obviously he was popular with African American audiences, but he was also very popular with white audiences because he often played virtuous, heroic, stoic characters who people generally liked and identified with. So he's part of this kind of larger trend that we start to see in the 50s and then a little bit more in the 60s, where we are beginning to see slowly more rounded black characters. Even some of the characters Poitier plays later on, they're not always saints. They're just more regular people. So they mentioned several movies that are kind of important. Some have Poitier, like The Defiant Ones. He's in that one from 1958. And then Odds Against Tomorrow, which stars, I believe, Harry Belafonte, who was friends with Poitier. Belafonte was a well-known musician who also acted during that time. But they also mention a film like The Manchurian Candidate, which had an African-American actor playing a pretty important supporting role. But that's characteristic of a new thing we start to see in the 60s, which is more and more roles being given to black characters that aren't specifically tied to race relations or, their sort of position in society. So this is often viewed as progress as well. You start to see black characters appearing in more everyday, normal situations, if we can use that term. Not situations that are explicitly tied to race relations in America. So again, their characters aren't always defined necessarily by their race or by their marginalized position in society. And to many, this represented progress, as we saw it more and more throughout the 60s. You could just sort of have black characters played by black actors showing up in mainstream movies as soldiers, dentists, milkmen, and there's no explicit comment on their race. You could even maybe think about an example that we've seen from Bullitt, which came out in the late 60s. If you remember, the doctor who Bullitt talks to in that film was an African American, but you could also argue that one of the reasons why the evil, bad politician guy later requests that they change doctors, again, this isn't made explicit in the film, but if you remember, he kind of wants that doctor off the case, for reasons that we don't quite understand, but he goes to some other person and says, I want him replaced. He's too inexperienced. So we're never quite sure if that's the real motive or if it's racially motivated, or if we're just thinking about the plot of the movie, maybe Robert Vaughn knows that the doctor's kind of buddies with Steve McQueen. I don't know. But there's certainly the possibility that it's racially motivated, because at that time, certainly some people would have had that kind of racist attitude. But within the film, certainly Bullitt never comments on it, the fact that the doctor is African American. So again, we're seeing more roles like that, where they're doing normal sort of everyday stuff, and it's not always explicitly tied to race relations. But another thing starts to happen in the next decade, in the 70s. We have a new genre that's largely created by African American filmmakers called blaxploitation. So sometimes this term is used in kind of an unfavorable way, but it really just refers to films that come out mostly in the first half of the 70s that were largely sort of made to appeal to a primarily African American audience, featuring African American protagonists, and they often took place in distinctly African American settings or milieus, often urban centers. A great example is Shaft, which we might be familiar with. They did a remake in the 2000s that was not very good. In fact, there's been a whole series, I think, with Samuel L. Jackson, but the original comes out in 1971. And there's a lot of other similar films coming out around that time, often, again, created by black filmmakers, starring black actors. Again, they're kind of centered on black heroes or kind of anti-heroes. But as the book points out, one thing you can notice with a film like Shaft and a lot of these other films is they're operating within familiar genres. So even though they are mostly marketed towards African American audiences, they're sort of familiar genres that all audiences liked. Gangster movies, cop movies, westerns. They mention a film Poitier directs in 1972, Buck and the Preacher, which is a western, but it's kind of an African American themed western, directed by Poitier and starring several prominent black actors and actresses. So this is kind of an interesting move that these types of 70s films perform. They're very much marketed towards an African American audience, but they're using familiar genres that have been around forever and have always been successful with all audiences. So that's a point they try to make in the book. They say, like, by the late 70s and early 80s, Hollywood executives had finally discovered that African Americans went and watched a lot of movies. The African Americans were actually a pretty big percentage of just like regular movie-going audiences. So the book argues that around this time, you see less blaxploitation films, you see less stuff that's specifically marketed for an African American audience, because the assumption becomes, hey, we don't have to specialize that much. We don't have to treat that audience as so separate. because a lot of the market research that these studio execs were looking at around 1980 were indicating that a lot of African Americans watched the same types of movies that other identity groups were watching. So they make that case to sort of explain why you got a little bit of a drop off in terms of African American representation at the end of the 70s and the early 80s. Again, you would see African Americans in films, right? They were playing roles. You could even think about the air traffic controller in that opening scene of Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So they were showing up in often small supporting roles, not always very much connected to race relations, but there weren't a lot of movies that featured African Americans in starring or leading roles, and there weren't as many being marketed specifically to an African American audience. So they say that's kind of how things started in the 80s. But later in the 80s, you start to see progress in the form of a handful of specific performers who achieve what might be called crossover success. That's the term they use, crossing over, meaning they become popular with white audiences. They become popular in this sort of larger mainstream way. So in the book, they mention Richard Pryor, Eddie Murphy, and Whoopi Goldberg as three African American performers in the 80s who sort of represent this crossing over phenomenon. You guys might be familiar with at least a couple of those. Richard Pryor, actually all three of them, got their start as stand-up comics, and then they all transitioned to acting. Pryor was pretty famous going all the way back to the 70s. I wouldn't say he ever quite became a full-blown movie star, but he was in a lot of good movies, not all comedies. He did some dramatic stuff as well. And then his life, his performing life at least, was kind of cut short by MS. He got sick around the beginning of the 90s, I think, and that kind of brought his career to an end. But if you might be familiar with some of his work with Gene Wilder, if you like old comedies like Silver Streak or Stir Crazy from like the late 70s and early 80s. We're probably more familiar with Eddie Murphy, who was first made famous by Saturday Night Live, and then he became a big movie star. He was in films like 48 Hours and Beverly Hills Cop in the 80s, and Whoopi Goldberg. She was in The Color Purple, which came out in 1985, directed by Steven Spielberg. That's a film based on the novel by Alice Walker, an African-American writer, and it's all about, African-American characters living in sort of segregated, economically impoverished rural setting, I believe in Georgia. But they mentioned that movie in the chapter because it's kind of significant in another way. Yeah, it helped to make Goldberg a star, and then she would later do stuff like Sister Act, which is a movie I remember from my youth, also the sequel, and some other largely comedic stuff. She doesn't really act much anymore. I think she's still on The View or one of those like daytime talk shows. But The Color Purple was significant not just because it helped to launch her career, but as they point out in the book, also because it was directed by Spielberg. And it was one of these examples of films in the 80s directed by famous white directors, but featuring largely African-American thematic material and many African-American actors. So again, that might not strike us as particularly rare or unique now from our modern day vantage point, but back in the 80s, it was rare. Again, like we've seen with some of these examples, if you were going to find a movie that really sort of authentically captured black experience or the African American sort of, culture, a lot of times it wasn't going to be within the Hollywood machine. You'd have to find somebody like Oscar Micheaux, who was kind of operating outside the industry, and even someone like Sidney Poitier. He eventually became a director, started making his own movies, but first he was an actor in movies directed by white people for decades. And even those blaxploitation movies in the early 70s that were directed by African Americans and starred African Americans, again, they were targeted mostly for an African American audience, still kind of segregated. But in the 80s, you have filmmakers like Francis Ford Coppola, Clint Eastwood, and Steven Spielberg tackling what might have been considered like African American subject matter, stories about African Americans, and in the case of The Color Purple, is obviously based on a novel written by an African American. All the major characters were African American. So the fact that Spielberg took on that project, made the movie, and then it was very popular and successful, that was significant. That's a significant sort of turning point in the mid-'80s to have this sort of, again, more of a crossover, white directors handling African American material, and that stuff being successful nationwide, winning Oscars and launching careers. But Eddie Murphy continues to be pretty famous. I would just mention him as maybe the biggest star of the ones that they list in the chapter. He's not maybe a huge movie star anymore, but most people know who he is. Maybe that's more from SNL, but it's hard to overstate how big he was in the 80s. He was still doing stand-up. His stand-up specials were really big. They would sell those, I remember going to Blockbuster as a kid, and you would see Eddie Murphy's Raw, one of his stand-up performances, and it would, you could rent it on VHS just like you could any other film. But he gets really big as a result of 48 Hours and Beverly Hills Cop, which were kind of comedic action movies, and they kind of positioned him as this ultra cool, funny, but also street smart and resourceful type character, and he was a huge smash hit with all kinds of audiences. So again, many people would point to Eddie Murphy and say he helped to pave the way by crossing over and having mainstream success. He helped to pave the way for a lot of future African American artists. But another big development in the 80s is the emergence of Spike Lee, who directs Do the Right Thing, one of our films for this week. So they mentioned that in the chapter, and you can also check out the little breakout section on Spike Lee, which begins on page 508 in the book. But he's another figure, I would argue, who's a little bit like Eddie Murphy. Maybe you haven't seen his movies, maybe you're not all that familiar with his career, but chances are you have seen Spike Lee somewhere in some capacity. He's kind of a fixture in our pop culture even today. So if you're a sports fan, if you watch NBA basketball, you've probably seen him. If you've ever watched the New York Knicks play on TV, Spike Lee is a huge Knicks fan. He's usually sitting courtside. So if you ever watch a Knicks game, you will see him at some point. If you watch any TV, really, you might have noticed a Capital One ad campaign featuring Samuel L. Jackson and I think like Jennifer Garner and Charles Barkley, a former basketball player. If you've ever seen those commercials, you've also seen Spike Lee, because he's a member of this strange group of friends that goes around and gets into various adventures. So you still see him. He pops up from time to time. You might see him on award shows. He's a documentary filmmaker. He continues to make fiction films. And he's made a lot of popular, pretty famous movies that a lot of people have seen. But he's one of these figures where even if you haven't actually seen his movies, you're still probably somewhat aware of who he is. He actually, gets famous largely in the 80s due to his first few films. So they mentioned this in the chapter. She's Gotta Have It is his debut. That comes out in 1986, followed by School Days, which is sort of like a musical set at a historically black university. That comes out in 1988. And then Do the Right Thing, which comes out in 1989. But also in the late 80s, he was in a series of Nike commercials with Michael Jordan. And these don't air anymore, so if you're not at least as old as me, these probably don't mean anything to you, but it's worth mentioning just because they help to make Spike Lee famous, and they kind of help to position him within our popular culture. So in these commercials, at the time, Michael Jordan was still kind of a young player, kind of an ascending young player. who was renowned for his dunking ability. So in these commercials, Spike Lee is actually playing the character that he portrays in She's Gotta Have It, Mars Blackman. And he's commenting on Jordan's dunking, and in the commercials, he generally says the sort of tagline for the ad campaign, which is, "It's gotta be the shoes," as a way to explain how Jordan can perform all of these acrobatic dunks. So this is kind of important if you're thinking about crossing over, because She's Gotta Have It was popular, but it didn't make like a ton of money at the box office. It was popular with critics and some audiences, but even if you hadn't seen that movie and you didn't initially know who Spike Lee was supposed to be, you got to know him over the course of those commercials. And Mars Blackman's kind of a nerdy, quirky guy who's kind of providing this commentary on Jordan doing all these spectacular athletic feats. So those commercials were kind of funny, they were fun to watch, they were memorable, and those helped to kind of propel him into fame as well. So just a little bit of a tangent there, but again, it's just kind of interesting how that happened, and also people point to that ad campaign and the rise of basketball, like professional basketball in the 80s, thanks to Jordan and like Magic Johnson and Larry Bird. They point to that as being really important in the development of what we might now call like sneaker culture. A lot of people are really into basketball shoes, and that Nike ad campaign featuring Spike Lee was a big part of that. It was already kind of a cultural phenomenon, again, often found within African American and other like minority communities, but that those commercials, that ad campaign made it mainstream, made it accessible and understandable to everybody. And that's always important when you're talking about like cultural history or how things might change over time. So Spike Lee's pretty important, and he would continue to make a lot of movies throughout the 90s and into the 2000s, including Malcolm X, starring Denzel Washington. That came out in 92. He would also work with Denzel Washington in He Got Game, which is kind of a basketball-themed movie that comes out in the mid-90s. But he's done some other stuff as well that doesn't especially pertain to race relations. So stuff like Summer of Sam, 25th Hour, or some of his popular films from the early 2000s. The Black Klansman came out fairly recently, and also Da 5 Bloods, I think, is his most recent fiction film. But he's done many others. You could check out his filmography. He's done a lot. And again, many of those movies have kind of broken into the public consciousness and have been viewed and celebrated by many, and Do the Right Thing is a good example. It's a controversial film, and that's why I kind of gave you a little bit of that warning at the beginning of lecture, and it's also why I'm giving you the option to watch a different film, because the movie can be upsetting to some. It can make some people feel, a sort of wide mixture of emotions, which I think was probably part of the point. He is tackling some pretty explosive, controversial stuff. I'll provide a little bit of context briefly, but I also just want to talk about the way he makes his movies, because it's kind of significant, and it kind of reminds us of Oscar Micheaux, who we were talking about earlier. So Lee has his own production company called 40 Acres and a Mule. And he's used that company to produce almost all of his movies going back to the 80s. So his business model is very interesting, and it's been copied by a lot of other independent filmmakers who want to get their own unique voice out, but they also want their movies to be seen by a wide audience. So how do you strike that balance? Well, for Lee and a lot of other modern filmmakers, the answer is to have complete creative control at the production level. So that means when you're making the movie, you're in charge. You don't have to take orders from the studio executives who are overseeing the production. You and the people that work for you are overseeing the production. So that's how Spike Lee's often like to operate. But what's interesting, though, is he kind of has this arrangement with Universal, one of the big studios, and maybe he's done this with other studios too. But typically, once the movies are shot, once they've been, produced, created, he has a distribution deal with these major studios like Universal, and they take over distribution, so they are able to get the movie distributed throughout the US, and it can be shown at movie theaters throughout the US. So again, he's producing his movies independently. But then those other two levels of filmmaking, distribution and exhibition, he's using the major studios to help him with those. So that's how you get the unique, individual, independent, creative vision distributed and exhibited to a mass audience. So it's not just other black filmmakers who have been inspired by that, but all kinds of independent filmmakers who like that model. And they're creating, once they have some success, right, and they have some money, they're creating their own production companies so they can do exactly what Spike Lee has done for years. So again, Do the Right Thing is his third film. And you'll notice that Lee is wearing many hats. So he directs, he writes, he produces, and in these early films of his, he is also acting. And I mentioned that he acted in those Nike commercials with Jordan. He would later stop acting. By the 90s, he had pretty much retired as an actor, and now he works exclusively behind the camera, and he no longer acts. I think he probably realized he was a better director than he was an actor, but in Do the Right Thing, he plays the lead role. He is the protagonist, Mookie. Probably not, well, to some, he's the most interesting character. A lot of people are kind of drawn to many of the supporting characters in this film, but Mookie is kind of the center, and he is the leading man. But normally he would play supporting roles, and then eventually he would stop acting altogether. So again, what many critics point out with Lee, what makes him really interesting, and the reason many people write about him and talk about him, is because he is, by and large, a commercial filmmaker. Now, I don't mean he's making commercials. I think he has directed some. But I mean he's like commercially successful. His movies have made a lot of money. They have been profitable at the box office. So that's what it means to be a commercial filmmaker. But he's also regarded as a filmmaker who can really capture what might be considered like African American culture in a sort of authentic way that doesn't feel exploitative or condescending or limited in the way that a lot of earlier white-made films probably did. So he's often kind of held up as unique for that reason. Again, that might be considered like crossing over, appealing to black culture while also finding commercial success that goes beyond just one particular group, selling tickets to all kinds of people and getting a very broad viewership. So this movie in particular is often held up as being very representative in many ways of black culture, but it's also accessible and enjoyable, or at least interesting, to virtually any viewer. But you can kind of break it down. The jazz score, the music that we largely hear, is composed by his dad, Bill Lee, who was a very celebrated jazz musician. So, again, jazz is often thought of as a part of kind of an older African-American culture and lineage going back to, the early 20th century. So we hear that, but it's also juxtaposed with contemporary, or at least what was contemporary in the late 80s, contemporary rap and hip-hop music, largely Public Enemy, who some of you might be familiar with. Chuck D still shows up from time to time, and I think Flava Flav does too. I'm not sure if that group is still together in any form, but they were a very important rap group in the late 80s. And you guys might know this if you're fans of rap music, like you might know that the 80s, especially the late 80s, was, again, a time of crossing over for rap, which had previously been kind of underground and had been sort of unique to African American communities. By the late 80s, it was becoming mainstream. Rap albums were selling a lot thanks to groups like Public Enemy, NWA, Beastie Boys, and more people were buying these albums, listening to rap. Again, a lot of white people were increasingly listening and enjoying listening to and enjoying rap music. So we have this juxtaposition, kind of an older form of black culture and black music in Bill Lee's jazz score, and then more cutting edge, more new sort of black culture and black music represented by Public Enemy. We hear both. We also have that opening dance sequence performed by Rosie Perez, who plays Mookie's love interest in the film. Rosie Perez continues to act. Many of you have probably seen her in other movies. She was in White Men Can't Jump with Woody Harrelson, the original, not the very bad remake that they just came out with. Again, that's a scene that might not land the same way to us in 2024, but that was a very big deal in '89 because Rosie Perez, who was a New York native, she's doing a sort of a dance style that wouldn't have been recognizable or familiar, frankly, to a lot of white audiences back in 1989. So this is another way of sort of broadcasting or helping to popularize a specific aspect of African American or black, or in this case, sort of Latino culture as well, that just wasn't quite mainstream yet, wasn't known to a super broad audience yet. And this is helping to change that. And also, again, some little things that we're probably going to miss. You might recognize Samuel L. Jackson as the radio DJ in the film. He has, of course, become a huge star since this movie came out. But also, some of the older actors in the film who you might not think as much about, DeMayer and also Mother's Sister. If you remember, if once you've seen the film, if you remember those particular characters, that's actually a real life husband and wife acting team. Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee played those two roles. And again, those aren't names that I would expect you guys to be familiar with, but they were both contemporaries of Sidney Poitier. And in fact, I think Ossie Davis appeared in several movies with Poitier and maybe even directed him in a movie or two. And I think later Poitier maybe directed Davis in a movie or two. But anyways, they all came from the same generation in the 50s, really the first generation of black actors who were able to make it in like mainstream Hollywood. So to a black audience, Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee or would have been much like Sidney Poitier at the time. They would have been big deals. Like, you would have known who they were. You would have known that they were significant within sort of a black cinematic history. They're both dead now, I think, but you've probably seen them in other films. They continue to pop up in a lot of movies throughout the 80s into the 90s. I think Ruby Dee lived a little bit longer, but so they both show up, and that's significant as well. So again, at this time in 1989, there just weren't many mainstream American films that authentically portrayed African American culture and life, and this movie does, but this movie also achieves a crossover level of mainstream success. So let's just note a couple of the technical achievements very quickly, then I'll sort of touch on theme briefly before we get in to Daughters of the Dust to wrap things up. But just some things to look for if you are watching Do the Right Thing. Very dynamic cinematography. Thanks to Ernest Dickerson, who was the cinematographer on this film. He often worked with Spike Lee, and then later Dickerson would go on to be a director in his own right. He's done many of his own films. He's also directed a lot of TV episodes over the years. So we see a lot of tracking shots. We see a lot of pans where the camera moves from side to side. We often see kind of somewhat unconventional or like off-kilter camera angles. And that's very much by design. We get some really dramatic zooms. We were talking about the new and improved zoom lens that came out in the 70s or the 60s. You can definitely see Lee utilizing that in this film. And also the convention of actors speaking directly into the camera. Something that wasn't super common back then, maybe a little bit more common now, but we see it a lot in this film. You could also mention the production design, the way the sets look, kind of like art direction. Think about the colors a lot of orange and red, really bright colors that often strikes viewers when they're watching. The costume design, thanks to Ruth Carter. I believe Ruth Carter might have also worked on Daughters of the Dust. I want to verify that. But the costumes were often remarked upon. The music, I've already mentioned. So lots of technical things that you could zero in on when analyzing this movie, and it's really just kind of a visual delight in terms of the way the camera moves, the colors, the editing. It's pretty fast-paced, kinetic, exciting, pretty easy to watch, and it starts out kind of comedic, right? A lot of people commented on how the tone sort of shifts. And there is this kind of underlying tension throughout as we sense that there are, some issues in this neighborhood, but early in the movie we have a lot of comedy, we have maybe more of a lighthearted tone, and then it kind of shifts later. But it all takes place in a single day. So this is sometimes referred to as a day in the life story structure. And it's kind of a nice, neat way to organize your screenplay, right? All of the events happen in pretty much one place, this neighborhood, Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn. One neighborhood, one day. We kind of start at the beginning of the day, and then we work our way up to the end of the day when things have gotten very explosive and violent. Technically, the final scene, I guess, takes place the following day, like the next morning after the riot, but most of the action is contained within a single day, and that was a very appealing format for a lot of young filmmakers who maybe didn't have a ton of money, but they were looking to structure a story that would be pretty easy to shoot and pretty easy to get made. And often a day in the life was viewed as a good sort of avenue for that because the action was kind of self-contained. You didn't need a lot of different sets or a lot of different settings. So a lot of other filmmakers, again, not necessarily just black filmmakers, but other young up-and-coming directors and screenwriters were kind of inspired by the story and the structure and how succinct and kind of tight it is and how most of it all gets contained within that single day. I won't get into all the different characters, but clearly we're meant to see that racism is very much a problem in this neighborhood, but I also think Lee wants us to kind of notice that the racism cuts a lot of different ways. There's a lot of different kinds of racism sort of on display. So we witness racism directed towards the black characters, and the John Turturro character, Pino, Pino's the bad brother, Vito is the nice brother. The two sons of the pizza guy, they sort of are polar opposites. So Pino represents a really sort of ugly racist attitude against African Americans, but we also notice that there's, again, other kinds of racism on display. A lot of mistrust, a lot of prejudice at work in this neighborhood. So we notice that, some black characters might be prejudiced against Koreans or against Italian Americans. We hear a white cop insult Puerto Ricans. This is a very diverse neighborhood. It's not just African Americans. There are other people there as well. And we notice that within all of these different groups, there's the Puerto Rican crew, there's African Americans, there's the white cops, there's the white guy in the Larry Bird shirt who's just moved to the neighborhood. There's tension, right, between all of these different groups, and nobody's really free of a certain degree of prejudice. So that is sort of made clear. And again, the tone shifts, the mood, the atmosphere starts out kind of comedic and lighthearted, and then it shifts into something very violent and explosive. So I'm not going to try to tell you guys how to interpret the ending of the film, the riot, the way the riot starts, but there's a lot of blame to go around, and I would just say, kind of using Spike Lee's own interviews and what he's often said in response to this question, like a lot of viewers will ask, did Mookie, the Spike Lee character, do the right thing? When he throws that trash can through the window, is he doing the wrong thing or is he doing the right thing? Is he standing up for his people, doing something that was long overdue, or is he victimizing this business owner and maybe hurting innocent people and starting a violent riot? I don't think there's a great way to answer that question. I think people are going to have different opinions. Obviously, that's natural. But I would just encourage you to maybe get a little bit past just deciding if he was right or wrong. Because Lee's often said that that's not even really a question that he considered. He has made the point that a lot of African American viewers don't ask that question, but a lot of white viewers do. And yes, there's questions of property damage. There's questions of maybe is Sal truly to blame? Does he deserve to have his pizza place burned to the ground? It's not true. It's not clear to me, but it's also clear that something has to change in the neighborhood. And there's a few little nuggets that modern viewers might miss that are kind of important to understanding maybe why Mookie does it, and maybe why characters like Radio Raheem are so angry. So during that riot scene, you guys might have heard a couple of things that, again, might not really land for modern viewers, but again, it's kind of hard to hear it, but during the riot, you might hear some people in the crowd shouting, Howard Beach, and you might also hear the name, I can't remember if you hear both names, but they're shouting at least one of the two names of Michael Stewart and Tawana Brawley. And these are names and events that might not mean much to us now, but they were important in '89. So Howard Beach is a particular neighborhood in New York City, and it was the scene of basically a hate crime in 1986, just a few years before the movie, where a young black man was, I believe, killed in a predominantly Italian-American neighborhood, either in Queens or Brooklyn. They beat him with baseball bats and either killed him or hurt him very badly. So they're referencing that event, and also Michael Stewart, who was a young black man killed by police, also in the 80s, and Tawana Brawley, who was a young black girl who I'm actually not quite remembering what happened with her, but these were all racially charged incidents that happened in New York City in the 80s, and they were all sort of part of the fire here, part of this larger tension that we're feeling in the neighborhood, is this idea held by many of the black residents of Bed-Stuy that they're not being treated equally, they're not being treated fairly by the city government, by the police, by other groups, and even though they are supporting local business and they're, continuing to sustain a thriving culture, they feel like they are kind of kept separate, marginalized, and maybe not given equal opportunity. So a lot of that historical context is kind of built in, like you're kind of reminded in the film of some of the reasons why they feel that way. Real life things that had happened recently in this area that might have made some of them feel that way. But of course, these characters are not a monolith, right? We hear DeMayor during the riot, played by Ossie Davis, trying to kind of calm people down and telling people not to attack the Korean store, right? So not everybody feels the same way. That's why it's complicated, right? And even that final scene between Mookie and Sal, the morning after the pizza place has been burned down, Sal's obviously very upset. But they don't hate each other, right? I mean, they have a very complicated, prickly relationship. I mean, Mookie worked for Sal. Sal seems to genuinely like Mookie and kind of look out for him, but also Sal might represent something negative in the neighborhood. It might not even be his fault personally, but it's more about what it means for a white-owned business or a Korean-owned business to thrive in a neighborhood where a lot of the African American residents are not thriving. So again, it's complicated. I don't think Lee really offers a one-size-fits-all answer. I think even that scene with Mookie and Sal, you can kind of read it a lot of different ways. I always read it like they kind of arrive at some type of begrudging agreement. They don't agree on the right thing, but they kind of understand maybe where the other one is coming from. But yeah, it's very open to interpretation. It does upset some people, and it makes some people maybe even angry. But I think that's what a lot of good art should do. It can spark a debate. We can exchange differing opinions. And you should also be reminded of that picture that we see Smiley kind of putting up in the pizza place. Again, everybody kind of focuses on Mookie and the trash can, but I would direct your attention a little bit more to that photo of MLK and Malcolm X and the two different quotes from those civil rights leaders that we read on the screen. They almost seem to contradict each other, and really throughout the film we get sort of this dichotomy with those two leaders, like, you know, and they're often reduced that way in a lot of public debate, right? MLK is often held up as the more peaceful, non-violent leader, whereas Malcolm X is viewed as more militant, and in some people would even say violent. An oversimplification probably on both fronts, because both men changed a lot of their attitudes over the course of their lives, but they might represent two different paths. And I would encourage you to think about those quotes, think about those two leaders, what they represent, and kind of what the path forward might be in a neighborhood like this. Okay, so let's just briefly talk about Daughters of the Dust. If you decide to go in that direction, this is also a very significant film. It comes out in 1991, just a couple of years after Do the Right Thing. And what makes it really significant is it was the first feature-length, theatrically released movie directed by a black woman to ever appear in the U.S. So that shocks some people when you think about 1991, not really that long ago, just a little over 30 years ago, was the first time that we had a movie, a feature-length movie, shown in theaters, directed by a black woman, Julie Dash. So that's significant just as like a historical fact, kind of a footnote, but the film itself is often celebrated, critically acclaimed, and even though it didn't make a ton of money when it first came out, it wasn't a big hit like some of Spike Lee's movies were, but it was very significant on a sort of aesthetic level. If you'll follow along with me just for a moment, if you watch the film, you're going to notice some imagery that you've maybe seen in other places in contemporary pop culture. So you might notice the white dresses, the beach, the ocean, some prominent blue colors from Indigo, big oak trees. Like if you're a little bit familiar with maybe Beyonce or her Lemonade album, or some other contemporary African-American artists, you're probably going to recognize some of that imagery because it's often been recycled and sort of reimagined in more modern times, perhaps most explicitly in some of Beyonce's cover art and I think music videos, particularly in the Lemonade era, borrowing very openly from the visual aesthetic of this film. So this movie looks a very particular way, and much of that has to do with the setting. So I wanted to provide just a little bit of context before we wrap up, because I know for many of us, especially if we're Westerners, we're not going to be all that familiar with the part of the world where this film takes place. We know New York City. We know Brooklyn, the setting of Do the Right Thing. But Daughters of the Dust is set on the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia. A very particular place, home to a specific African-American sort of subculture that's referred to in South Carolina as the Gullah people and often referred to in Georgia as Geechee. So this is kind of important to your understanding of the film. That's where we are, these islands off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia. And the reason they're kind of unique, and the reason Gullah and Geechee culture is unique, is because back during slavery times, these islands were kind of isolated from the mainland. So slaves who were brought over there to work on the islands were able to kind of retain more of their native African culture because they weren't around a whole lot of white people. They were kind of left to work the land. They were still obviously owned and controlled by white landowners, but a lot of those white landowners did not live on the islands year round because they would get malaria or whatever. So they would go to Charleston or Savannah or some nearby city where they could live perhaps more comfortably by their standards, and the slaves would largely run those plantations and raise sea cotton and indigo and the other cash crops that those islands were known for. They were very fertile, great for agriculture. So anyway, we don't have to know all the history, but just understand that they were able to retain certain aspects of their native religion, language, and other cultural markers that, slaves on the mainland would have lost, would have been forced to give up because of their living conditions. So that's why Gullah culture and Geechee culture to this day is a little bit distinctive. The way they speak, their clothes, certain spiritual practices that they have, and even some of the food that they eat still has really clear African roots in a way that you wouldn't necessarily find, in other parts of the country. So that's where we are. And if any of you are golf fans, or if you've ever watched golf on TV, you might actually have recognized some of these islands. Many of them were later turned into golf courses and huge, beach resorts, which is kind of sad in a way. But places like Hilton Head Island, Seabrook, Kiowa Island, where they play all these big golf tournaments, those were all formerly Gullah Sea Islands. And there are still a few that remain that are still kind of they haven't been developed all that much. They're still home to Gullah people. But a lot of the Gullahs have left the islands. They've done much like we see characters in the movie have done. They move up north. They go to cities like Philadelphia, New York, or closer cities like Savannah, Atlanta, or Charleston, where there might be more, economic opportunity. But they are still there. Some of them are still there. And the reason I'm kind of getting into this, and the reason I like this movie, or at least part of the reason why I like it, is I'm from the South Carolina coast, not the Sea Islands, but a few hours north, getting closer to North Carolina, not so much the Georgia direction, but heading north about, a couple hours. So I'm somewhat familiar with the area. I've been to some of the Sea Islands as a visitor, and they are quite beautiful. But what makes this movie also unique is the fact that, again, first one directed by a black woman. It's an entirely black cast, mostly led by black women. So again, just increasing representation, not just getting more African American voices, but also getting more African American women voices, which we didn't have a ton of in the 50s and 60s. Even with Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte, some of those early black stars, many of them were males. So you have more of a feminine perspective here. Interesting use of voiceover narration. You can think about some of the visual effects that we see. There is a little bit of what we might call special effects, or at least just the way certain things appear on screen might be kind of interesting. But again, think about the overall visual aesthetic. The costumes, the camera work, but also just the locations and how all of that looks, what that imagery does. And again, you might find some examples of that imagery showing up in other places in contemporary pop culture. Okay, so that's it for today. I know this was kind of a long lecture, but we had a lot to cover. So you'll pick one of these two films, or you can talk about both on this week's discussion board. So I hope you enjoy them, and I will see you next week.